Daryl, do you have anything you'd like to say by way of introduction of Steve?
I was not prepared for that, to be honest, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Okay, well, of course, Lisa sent out a great news release on the topic of the meeting. But yeah, Steve, welcome. Thanks for being here. And maybe just give us a little bio about yourself, a little background information before you jump into your program. That'd be appreciated.
Of course, yeah. First, I want to say thanks y'all so much for having me. Yeah, for setting everything up. I see some familiar faces. This is last year. I was honored to present about gray whales and their migration and the way they interact with Alaska and the Bering Sea, if any of y'all remember that. And I'll actually be touching on that a little bit in the presentation. But my name is Steve Backus. I work primarily as a field technician, working with birds. I've worked at Whitefish Point Bird Observatory. That's my connection to Michigan. I just recently finished a contract with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and I also work as a shipboard naturalist in ecotourism, primarily for a company called Lindblad Expeditions that I've traveled with to Baja California in Mexico since 2017. So that's the area that I'd like to talk to you about tonight, and that's been an amazing place that I've gotten to go, and through my job working with Lindblad, that's been my way of getting to experience the area. And I imagine some of y'all, maybe every now and then, people with Audubon studies, I feel like have run into Lindblad expeditions before, or maybe traveled with them, or at least heard about them. But they have a partnership with National Geographic, so it's kind of National Geographic's ship-based ecotourism arm is kind of the quickest way to say it. So that's my background, and yeah, is there anything else you'd like to say before I get started, or? Okay, cool. And just everyone, if you don't want to be heard, just make sure you're muted, please. I know this is a thing that happens a lot on Zoom. So I'm going to share my screen, and let me just make sure. Does everyone see a slide with some beautiful yellow-footed gulls sitting on saguaro cacti? Okay, cool. Just making sure. So I wanted to talk to you all about Baja California. So it's a really amazing place for a lot of reasons, but one thing that really makes it unique for me, in my experience there, is this wonderful area where you're getting to experience the Sonoran Desert and the Pacific Ocean and the Sea of Cortez, the Gulf of California, all at the same time. So you're getting to experience these interactions between marine environments and desert environments, which a lot of the times, at least I always thought of those environments as really, really different and not really interacting that much. You know, deserts don't have any water, but this is an area where that's markedly not true. So again, I mostly have traveled to Baja California with Lindblad Expeditions. This is the ship, the Seabird, the National Geographic Seabird, and that's a boat that I worked on for a few years. I worked on a couple other boats, and my role on the boat is a shipboard naturalist. So pretty much what I do is guide hikes, give presentations like this, help interpret wildlife, help interpret natural history and stuff like that. And I kind of wanted to give you a short overview of the area and my experiences there, you know, probably around half an hour if I don't get too excited about a topic and keep talking. So, but it's a really dynamic place. The boat I worked on, and every time I go there, I see really different things being there at different times of the year. There's a red-billed tropic bird that decided to camp out for the night on the National Geographic Seabird. So that was a really fun experience. And every time I experienced something new that I've never experienced before. So it's a really dynamic place. And depending on what time of year you're there, it can be incredibly different. Almost some of the areas almost look unrecognizable. And especially with the way that wildlife interacts with the Sonoran Desert and the marine environments too. A lot of the animals that we see there are only there for a short period of time and utilizing maybe just a few resources there. So just to kind of clarify where in the world we're talking about. So this is the Peninsula right here. We zoom in, you can actually see the US-Mexico border from space, from the satellite. And the peninsula is divided into two different states of Mexico, the state of Baja California and Baja California Sur. For brevity's sake, I'm going to refer to the area as Baja. That's a very common thing that people commonly refer to it as Baja. And if you go there, a lot of people will say Baja. And again, it's called California because during Spanish settlement, our state of California and Mexico's California were all one state before everything was divvied up and whatnot. But this area has so many unique areas that I wanted to highlight. For instance, the Colorado River empties into the Gulf of California. Gulf of California, also known as the Sea of Cortez. They're used interchangeably a lot of the time. Some people have preferences. I'll probably use both. But if anyone's read Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, which is a really, really beautiful text about natural history, he goes to this area and gets to see it before the water reclamation efforts were made, like all the dams that were put on the Colorado River. So this area was an incredible estuary full of all these lagoons, amazing wildlife. He talks about it a lot in that book, and it's really, really a beautiful and compelling text. At this point now, the Colorado River, when the water that touches the Gulf of California is but a drop. It's a very small fraction because of all the damming and particularly all the water needs for agricultural areas in Southern California primarily. But it's still a really incredible place. Another unique feature about it is the tides that are experienced in the Northern Gulf are some of the highest in the world, about 30 feet, and this is over a very long kind of tidal plain. So obviously that's really great for shorebirds, but it's really great for all kinds of wildlife. And it's also just really incredible to see. The tides are actually really, really unique, but we're going to talk about wildlife. The midriff region is another really interesting area. This is one of the most productive regions in the whole entire Gulf. You have this really deep, cold water in the Gulf of California. And because of wind-driven currents, you have a lot of upwelling, that cold water shooting to the surface. And this happens to the most intensity in this midriff region. And that causes lots of different phytoplankton and then everything that feeds on phytoplankton. So you see this really, really productive area and all kinds of members of the food chain there to take advantage of it. The Gulf Islands are these really unique little islands that if you visit the area, this is some of the more visited natural areas. And these are small islands just off the Cape region, which is just south of there. This is where like La Paz and Cabo San Lucas and if you fly there, this is likely where you go. But the Gulf Islands are really interesting. There's a lot of endemism there. There's a rattleless rattlesnake. That's one of my favorite things there, for instance. But a lot of endemic reptiles. There's these animals called chuckwallas that are essentially like iguanas. And a lot of the islands have their own unique chuckwalla. And it's just because these small water barriers that they couldn't transit. So it's a really, really interesting area. It's a protected area. It's part of the biosphere reserve. There's a lot of offshore islands. This one that I'm pointing to particularly we'll talk about later is the Guadalupe. And islands in general are wonderful stories of endemism, extinction, savior, dynamism. So they're always really interesting to me, especially being a person who particularly likes pelagic and water birds. And then on the Pacific coast of the Baja Peninsula, there's several bays, and these are shallow water bays, three of them primarily, that are really unique in a lot of ways. And one thing that gets a lot of attention is they're the gray whale calving grounds for the Eastern Pacific population of gray whales. So these gray whales migrate from their feeding grounds in the Bering Sea all the way down to Baja California, and they mate, breed, and raise calves in these small lagoons. And these are relatively safe waters. They're basically predator free because there's not as many killer whales that is the main predator for the gray whales in there. So they're really interesting areas. And then this is also the location of Mexico's largest protected area, the Vizcaino Biosphere Reserve. So this contains one of the Pacific bays, but also a few islands that again have some endemic birds, and it's just a really, really, really wild region. And the plant life there is really incredible too. So just to talk a little bit about the very old history here. So Baja was torn off of mainland Mexico as the Pacific Plate moved along the transform boundary of the San Andreas Fault. And again, it's only about 6 million years where it broke off, so it's relatively new, and it's still moving at about 2 inches a year to the northwest. So pretty quick as far as we're talking about plate tectonics and whatnot. And on the other image on here, this is some of the bathymetry, some of the water depths. And you can see that, especially what I wanted to point out was near the Cape region, some of the depths there are about 3,000 meters. So this is really, really deep water. And because of that, you have very cold water. And like I was talking about before, this really productive cold water getting shot to the surface, causing a lot of through a process called upwelling. And because of that, a lot of things are there to take advantage of that. And a lot of deep water species too, for instance, a lot of deep water squid, and then their predators are there also. So it's pretty amazing, pretty dynamic. And it's really, really, really diverse. So the 6,000 species of animals, most of those are invertebrates, macro and micro invertebrates. And we'll talk about some birds later, but I wanted to just take a minute to talk about some of the marine mammals, because I think that when a lot of people experience Baja and talk about it, especially in the wintertime, the marine mammals are some of the things that people really, really remember. For instance, the gray whale. I was talking about the Pacific lagoons and how the gray whale utilizes these lagoons. So you'll notice here that these people in a boat are really close. This is a boat that I was in, and you see a larger mother gray whale, and closer, that's actually a young calf. So these are calving lagoons. And the history of these bays is, I won't get too into it, but it's pretty dynamic, to say it lightly. When whalers discovered that gray whales utilize these lagoons, it was pretty much a free-for-all. So the whalers came in, and this is pre-industrial whaling, and decimated the populations of gray whales to basic economic extinction, where it was no longer profitable for them to harvest gray whales there. So effectively, we thought that they were extinct, but they weren't. They're a resilient population, and they recovered. After that, then industrial whaling decimated their population, but they still held on and recovered, which is pretty incredible that this whale's been threatened with extinction at least twice. And currently, the numbers are estimated to potentially be at a carrying capacity for this eastern North Pacific population of gray whale. So despite that, and despite that these bays were utilized by the US Navy as a bombing range for a long time, it's incredible that these gray whales are still present. And these are really shallow lagoons. These whales aren't feeding there at all. Gray whales feed particularly in the Bering Strait, these really, really shallow waters, about 300 feet deep, and they're bottom feeders. They go to the bottom, suck up mud. They're baleen whales. They filter it out, eat the different invertebrates that they eat. And then they have their long migration south to Baja, where they either mate or raise calves. And there's a lot of local fishermen here who, during this season, they make their living bringing people out to see the whales. So getting really close in these pangas, these fiberglass boats, out to have these kind of up close experiences, which is, I can't kind of emphasize like how different of an experience it is to have, because not only sometimes are you this close to gray whales, this is just a phone picture I took, but sometimes, again, these gray whales aren't feeding. Sometimes the mothers will push the calves up to the boats, and the young ones will kind of rub against the pangas, lift up their rostrums, their noses and whatnot. And you get these incredibly close experiences with, again, some of the largest, with 40-ton mammals. And this is after, like for me, like seeing these animals is incredible, but thinking about their story is amazing. This is the longest migration of any mammal recorded, 14,000 miles from some of their feeding grounds in the Bering Sea and Eastern Russia, all the way down to these lagoons. So they're pretty incredible, and this area is vital to their life cycle. These three particular Pacific lagoons. So if you ever visit, this is definitely a big part of the experience there. Some other of the charismatic megafauna that the area is known for: sperm whales and blue whales. Sperm whales, I was talking about the deep water there. Sperm whales are really, really deep divers. So they've been documented to dive like up to 3 kilometers down to some of the deepest waters in the Gulf of California. And primarily they're feeding on really deep water squid, some of the larger squid, the Humboldt squid, the jumbo squid and whatnot. So, and this area is so productive that sperm whales typically will only utilize areas during parts of their annual cycle. They're usually not resident, but there is a resident population of sperm whales in the Gulf of California because it's so productive, because they can stay there year round, which is pretty incredible. So as far as a reliable place to see them, this is one of the top ones, particularly on the Gulf side, not on the Pacific side. Blue whales also, largest animal that's ever lived. A lot of the footage that you might see in nature documentaries and whatnot of blue whales is from the Pacific coast of either Baja or Southern California. I had one of the most amazing experiences of my life, seeing about 6 blue whales lunge feeding together. And their most, which was pretty incredible to see one, but to see that many together was really, really incredible. And I'm going to play another little video real quick of this is another one of our beautiful charismatic megafauna. This is California sea lions, and this is they have these areas where a lot of the young males will just be resting, be hauling out. They're not breeding; they're just kind of growing up, and it offers these unique opportunities. This is footage that I took that's just standing still while snorkeling. This one came and checked things out and chewed on the camera for a little bit, but didn't realize it was actually just a camera, kind of boring, and moved along. But so getting to see these animals is obviously really, really special, and an important part of the ecosystem down there. Whale sharks, these are one of the big celebrities for the area too. Just talking about the different diversity. This is the largest bony fish in the world. And they're in the Gulf of California primarily in the winter time. So if you go to like the Malecon, the waterfront of La Paz, the biggest city down in Baja California Sur, there will be a line of ponga operators who are they're just advertising trips to go out and see the whale sharks or to snorkel with them and whatnot. So it's really, really reliable. They're there and people can go out and see them. And I was on a small boat trip, and we just saw this one near the surface and put a camera down in the water, and just it swam alongside our boat for maybe half an hour. So it was pretty incredible. And to talk about some of the other marine mammals, we'll talk about another marine mammal around here, the vaquita porpoise. So this is a really small porpoise, world's smallest, little under 5 feet, so pretty tiny. And this porpoise lives in the Gulf of California. Traditionally, it would live in the Northern Gulf in the kind of murkier waters, and that's still primarily where it is. And it was feeding on totuaba, which is this endangered fish. That's an anadromous fish. It used to swim up the Colorado, but obviously because of water reclamation dams and things like that, the habitat looks very different. And varying impacts have caused this porpoise to become critically endangered. Last count that I know of was in 2019, and there was about 20 of them left. So this is a really, really incredible animal that I unfortunately feel fairly confident that we'll see its extinction within our lifetimes. But there's a lot of efforts going on to save this species. There's a lot of emphasis on its protection. And even if the vaquita is unsavable, perhaps, the efforts to save it are ecosystem-wide. There's a lot of different impacts that the vaquita, there's a lot of different regions and issues that the vaquita affects. So yeah, and I'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But it's an Audubon Society, so let's talk about the birds, because that's primarily what we're here for. So there's a lot of different ecoregions in Baja, and this is just kind of a short glance, just the different colors, just to show some of the different variety. You have some in the Cape region and some of the mountainous regions. You have various levels of forest and high elevation habitat, contrasting with the marine habitat, contrasting with the Sonoran Desert. This is still a part of the Sonoran Desert. So, for instance, I'm assuming some of you have also, if you haven't been here, you've been perhaps to Southern Arizona. So like Tucson area and whatnot, which is also the Sonoran Desert. So this is the kind of extreme southern range of the Sonoran Desert. And then barriered across on the mainland, on the other side of the Sierra Madre Occidental, you have the Chihuahuan Desert. So there's a few different deserts going here, but this is the Sonoran Desert with its own unique geography, its own unique ecosystem, and all the inhabitants of it that are unique to it as well. So just kind of a numbers thing real quick. We're around, it's under 500 species, but there's also a lot of endemic species there. And there's obviously debates, like there always are. Some are considered subspecies, some are considered full species by different people. Some are, AOS recognizes, some, different organizations bicker about the exact numbers, but that kind of gets us close. And then the numbers of introduced and primarily extinct species is still being tallied up, still being figured out, particularly because the offshore islands that are that constitute part of the area of Baja. So endemics, we all love endemics, right? This is some of the most exciting stuff. It's birds that live in these areas and nowhere else on Earth. And Baja has a lot of them, especially when you get to the islands. But a lot of these birds, these are all endemic birds in Baja that probably familiar to you. For instance, the gray thrasher in the center is obviously an endemic version of the curve-billed thrasher. The Belding's yellowthroat is our common yellowthroat. The Xanthus's hummingbird is an endemic radiated version of the broad-billed hummingbird. So you can kind of see how this all works out. And that same concept relates to a lot of the birds on the islands as well. For instance, a few of the islands have endemic house finches that are just their own species, that they're at their own species level because of how remote they've lived and how long they've been there. But not all birds are endemic who visit Baja. It's kind of, some birds utilize it as a migratory pathway, but a lot of birds there are there primarily for either a winter, summer breeding season, or resident ones. And I kind of wanted to use some of the wonderful eBird graphics, animated graphics, to kind of show you some different species and how they utilize the area. For instance, orange-crowned warbler. This is a bird that is absent in the summertime and only passes through Michigan, to my understanding, during migration. But during the wintertime, it's thick with orange-crowned warblers down in Baja. It's a bird you'll see pretty commonly. And that contrasts with birds like purple martin, where this bird only utilizes the area in the summer months. So it is a breeding bird down during the summertime, where it's absent in the winter. Then, of course, we have our resident birds, like this is the verdin, a small passerine that you see really frequently. And though we say resident, that's not exactly true. Like they are there year round, but they're not, they move around. You can see this kind of seasonal distribution, them going from finding breeding territories, establishing those, and then dispersal during during the fall when a lot of the ones are finding new areas and habitat. And if you haven't seen these maps before, these are all on eBird's site under the status and trends, and they're all powered by eBird observations. So if you've ever put an orange-crowned warbler on eBird, then you were part of making that graphic, or even these other two species. So thank you. And birds can tell us so much about an area. You know, we're not only learning about the birds when we learn about the birds, but we're learning about the habitats they inhabit, the food sources they use, their relationship in the ecosystem, and particularly the habitats that they're utilizing. So I wanted to kind of take 3 different species to kind of zoom in on some of the different areas and habitats and some of the different issues affecting those habitats. So for instance, the magnificent frigate bird, some of you might remember a frigate bird spotted at Whitefish Point last year. You know, it could have been a magnificent frigate bird. I haven't seen how it's ruled on yet, but this is an incredible bird. A lot of you that have ever been to the tropics have probably experienced this bird, getting to see it. They have this really foreboding shadow that kind of floats overhead. They're really, really distinctive and just really, really beautiful. And just a quick thing on ID, the males have the red gular pouch and that they're able to inflate during breeding displays. And the females typically have this kind of white breast. And these birds are kleptoparasites, so meaning they get a significant portion of their food through harassing other birds and stealing their catch. That's not the only way they feed. They also are able to feed themselves. I just want to show you a quick little video of, they go after flying squid and flying fish. This is a pair of them going after flying fish, and obviously the flying fish has a pretty hard time because it's there's a mahi waiting to eat it as soon as the frigate bird gets up. So here's a juvenile one and a female going after one. But here's kleptoparasitism. These are great frigate birds, not magnificent, harassing either a master or a Nazca booby. So you can see it's harassing this bird until it regurgitates what was in its crop. But I guess that's not enough, because also this bird goes after the booby and kind of beats it up a little bit. Anyway, even though it already got its food. So these are really menacing looking birds, and I think they kind of earned that reputation. And, you know, being kleptoparasites like Jaegers and whatnot, there's a lot of different birds and a lot of different animals that are so specialized. You know, with seabirds, they can dive deep to get a specific kind of prey that a surface feeder can't. Like a lot of the prey that is just on the surface, the frigate birds wouldn't have access to. But as opposed to being adapted to feed on these different, really specific kinds of prey, you can open yourself to a buffet of all kinds of different things if you're just really good at stealing. So as opposed to being good at different kinds of diving or different kinds of feeding techniques, they're really good at beating up other birds and stealing food from them. And almost every time I watch a bird catch something on the water, I won't even see a frigate bird around and it'll zoom in. I've seen a peregrine falcon pick up an eared grebe and like 4 frigate birds on it right away, for instance. So it's pretty incredible. So obviously we can't ignore this giant gular pouch. You know, this is a lot of different birds have gular pouches. All the pelicaniforms, for instance, like, you know, pelicans, cormorants, and owls, for instance, have these gular pouches that they'll use to in a lot of different ways. And I'll kind of talk about some of that later. But another interesting thing about frigate birds, and this is a great frigate bird from the Galapagos, is so despite being birds that are primarily oceanic, they spend so much of their life feeding on the ocean, near the ocean. They very, very rarely land. They're not good at taking off from the water, and they're also not, they can't stay on the water very long because the way that their feathers absorb water, and then they can potentially drown. So it's kind of this interesting curse almost, that a bird that's primarily a water bird can't really touch the water itself. So these are really, really agile birds, and they're really well adapted to their kind of particular situation. So they have the lightest wing loading of any bird. Their skeleton weighs about half as much as their feathers. So they have this really, really long wingspan, this really broad wingspan, with really thin wings and a really light body that lets them stay aloft for a really long time. So when you see them, a lot of times they're soaring, and they're effortlessly soaring, not flapping, just kind of riding wind currents, maybe riding thermals going up. So a question came up of, when do they sleep if they're spending so much time out on the water, and can't land on the water to sleep like a lot of other seabirds do, like pelagic birds do, for instance. And I mean, just to give you a bit of a time frame, some frigate birds have been monitored spending about 2 months at sea on these foraging trips, and this is 2 months where they're not sleeping regularly. But what they're doing is called unihemispheric shortwave sleep. So they're sleeping half their brain at a time. And this isn't unique to frigate birds. A lot of ducks do it, a lot of waterfowl. If you see a duck with like its head tucked in and one eye open, it could be sleeping that side, the opposite side of its brain. For instance, whales do this a lot. A lot of marine mammals do this, porpoise and whatnot. But researchers hooked up all these different instruments to these great frigate birds and tried to actually study what was going on. And they found that particularly during their riding thermals, their soaring, they'd sleep half their brain for a couple seconds at a time, adding up to about 45 minutes a day of sleep. So it's pretty incredible. They're actually able to sleep on the wing. They sleep the side of the brain opposite to the direction of the travel of the eye they're using, so they don't run into anything. And then when they're down on their nesting sites, these are arboreal nesters, so primarily in mangroves. Some of them are sleeping over 12 hours a day, so kind of compensating it. But as far as birds go, this is, again, not a completely unique behavior. For instance, pectoral sandpipers that I'm sure some of you all seen up in Michigan. I remember they were always a really big delight at whitefish for me. I really like these shorebirds. On their breeding grounds in the Arctic, in the land of the midnight sun, where it's light 24 hours a day, the most productive breeding birds are the ones that can stay up the longest. So these birds have been documented not sleeping for over 2 weeks. And the males that can stay up that long are just constantly displaying and constantly breeding. And they're the ones who exhibit the most success. And then, which is pretty incredible. But I think what actually holds the record is, some of you might have seen this, the common swift, European bird, an old world bird. It's it was unsure where these birds actually wintered. And through different research, it was found that they actually winter on the wing. So they'll migrate south, but they're not landing during this 10-month period. They're only landing in these, these vertical spots where they breed, similar to chimney swifts and other swifts. They're only landing in their breeding season. The rest of the time, they're spending their whole entire year on the wing. And they're doing that same unihemispheric shortwave sleep, they're kind of sleeping half their brain at a time. And at that time, there can be thousands of feet up in the air, and they're mostly feeding on aerial plankton. So like spiders and insects and whatnot that are kind of utilizing air currents, which for me is just blows my mind, to think that like at any point, in the right area, thousands of feet up, there's swifts all over the place eating spiders that are also thousands of feet up. So it's pretty incredible, I think. And yeah, Audubon wanted to mention that 10 months is a very long time. I thought that was a nice little headline. But talking about bird diversity in Baja, there's a saying that it's busier in the desert at midnight than it is at noon. So, and as far as for the avian communities, owls are obviously the birds that take advantage of the night the most. There's a pretty good diversity of owls in Baja. There's a lot more once you get into mainland Mexico. But a lot of these species are species that, well, all these species are ones that we have experience with, or we have records of in the US, for instance. So pretty good amount of diversity. A lot of the prey comes out at night because the intensity of the desert. A lot of plants and animals will wait till nighttime to really utilize their habitat. A lot of flowers will only bloom at night. A lot of mammals will only come out at night. And during those times, a lot of the predators will then only come out at night. So hence why they do so well. And it's such a good area for owls that there are 2 species that are, this is another endemic. Are they subspecies? Are they species? But the Baja pygmy owl is considered a species by many institutions. And that is primarily a higher elevation owl. So you can find in the mountains of the Cape region and whatnot. And then there's a subspecies of elf owl as well. So these are both small owls. The desert's a pretty noisy place at night too. There's lots of bats as well. There's even in Baja, there's a fish-eating bat, which is really interesting. But a lot of these owls are going after small rodents, large insects, and what other prey they can kind of utilize. And on the right is the elf owl, which just to take a second with it, it is the world's smallest owl. It's about the size of a song sparrow, about, and it utilizes cavities in Baja and saguaro cactus, and these are cavities that are mostly made by woodpeckers, by Gila woodpeckers, by ladderbacks, gilded flickers, and whatnot. And they've shown a preference to north-facing cavities because, as you can imagine, is a little bit less exposure to the sun and stays a little bit cooler. So these are really, really special animals to get to see. They can be, like a lot of small birds, they can be really territorial and really aggressive, which I think is always an interesting thing to notice in birds, like how hummingbirds are so aggressive and whatnot. But most elf owls in the region, like especially ones in Arizona and whatnot, will migrate south into bigger parts of mainland Mexico. But elf owls, again, this is an endemic subspecies for the area. Another owl that we'll see that is around there that utilizes the habitat really well is the burrowing owl. And one thing that I feel like always strikes people about burrowing owls is how long their legs are. But I will point out that actually most owls, their legs are that long. So this is, for instance, a great horned skeleton, but they just have huge fluffy feather pants that are covering these really, really long legs. But that being said, burrowing owls do stick out. For instance, this is one running, which is a behavior you usually don't see in any owls. So that really showcases their long legs and how these birds can fly, but how they're really well suited for these kind of open habitats. And they utilize prairie dog burrows, other animals' burrows. They'll clean them up and whatnot, but this is where they'll have their nests, where they'll stay when they're looking to get out of the heat. And one other interesting thing I think about burrowing owls is the young will actually, as a defensive mechanism, when they're in their burrows, if they detect a predator coming, they'll make a rattlesnake call, which I think is kind of interesting to try to deter whatever predators to think that this burrow is full of rattlesnakes. So let's talk about islands just a little bit. Another habitat we have around here is the Guadalupe, is a really, really interesting area. This is the offshore island in the Pacific. And originally this was named Isla de los Pájaros, which is the island of birds, because of the amount of birds, because of the endemism there. And it's remote and rugged. And at the time, when it was first described, it was home to more endemic bird species than any other island off the Pacific coast of North America. So this is where it is. These offshore islands are really, really great for colonial nesting seabirds. And so a lot of seabirds will utilize this, still utilize this area. But obviously a lot of birds that found here, instead of migrating back and forth, they're utilizing going back to the mainland, stayed there and became endemic versions of themselves. And for instance, these are some of the endemics, most of the endemics that have been driven to extinction. Not all of them, but most of the endemics there. And this is a list of some of them that are all extinct at this point in time, as far as we know. And some of the big drivers of this extinction are when American and Russian seal hunters were coming here for the fur seals, when they were collecting fur seals during the Great Hunt, they introduced goats as a food source. So this was common in a lot of seafarers. They would introduce goats to an island. So when they came back, they could get more goats because the goats would just populate the island. And then also inadvertently, they introduced rats. And we all know how this cycle goes. It's a story that's been told over and over again. The goats are there, the rats are there, cats were then introduced, and these just decimate the populations of birds, and particularly the endemic birds, and particularly the birds that are more accustomed to a terrestrial lifestyle. So these are some of the birds that were lost. I think that the amount of goats, the population at its peak was predicted about 100,000 goats on this island, which is pretty incredible. That population is unsustainable. Once those goats ravaged the island, the population crashed to about 10,000, which is still a lot. And the Guadalupe caracara, the one on the bottom there, was actually ironically hunted by seal hunters because it was preying on the goats. So this caracara, this raptor, might have had an impact on the goat populations, on the young goats, but ironically, that's the reason it was hunted out also. So with all that being said, there is an effort. There's been actually a very thorough and very successful effort to rid this island, Isla Guadalupe, of a lot of these predators. So starting in 2002, there was a campaign to get rid of all the goats, and it was successful. And to eliminate the rats and cats, some of that work is still ongoing, but it's definitely going on. And one of the motivations that really kind of pushed people to start some of these eradication campaigns was in 1983, some Lason's albatross started nesting on Isla Guadalupe, and this is from the colony. At first, it was only 4 pairs noted, but 4 pairs, hopefully in a colonial nesting seabird will mean more and more as time goes on. So this was seen at the time as the most important growing colony for the Eastern Pacific. So there was a big impetus to get rid of the cats in the area, to eliminate their predators. So, and it was primarily successful. It's obviously cats are very resilient. It can be too hard to tell, but these seabirds, these very long-lived seabirds, are nesting more and more successfully every single year because of these eradication efforts. So a lot of these islands give us this really kind of unique opportunity to see these extinctions and these crashes, but also the idea of, for instance, getting rid of introduced species on a continental scale is incredibly overwhelming, but on an island scale isn't always so. There's many predator eradication efforts that have been pretty successful on island habitats. So again, these animals can be really resilient if we can just give them a chance, if we can give them a preview of what a potentially a habitat that's less impacted could look like. Another island that's incredibly important to the region is Isla Rasa. This means flat island. And it's a pretty small place. It's about 142 acres. But primarily what puts it on the map for avifauna is it's where 95% of the world's harriman skulls and elegant terns breed. So this was another island that was plagued by rats and other predators, but they were eliminated to give these birds a chance again. And these are really charismatic birds. If you've ever seen a harriman skull or elegant terns, they're really, really beautiful. And 95% of the world's population, this is a really small island, it's kind of hard to visualize, but it's about 260,000 harriman skulls and about 180,000 elegant terns. And this is all on a very small island, all on top of each other. It's very loud, it's very noisy, it's very smelly, and it's really, really beautiful and gorgeous. It's a really amazing place to get to see. And it's right in the Midriff Island region, the most productive area inside the Gulf of California. And so again, you have these really deep waters to the south, these really productive waters. And as the wind-driven currents, these strong winds coming up and down the Sea of Cortez come through, that displaces the warm water, and the cold water comes up to replace it. And in this particular area, the bathymetry of it makes it one of the most productive areas, the most productive area as far as biomass and phytoplankton and whatnot in the Gulf of California. So, which is pretty incredible. But of course, like any other island, that has its own threats. I didn't read the report I'm not sure if there's a report from 2020, but in 2019, virtually no there's very, very low breeding success, very low reproductive success. In some of the years, it's just documented at 0 in the past couple of years. And so because of that, some of these birds have been finding new nesting sites. And unfortunately, a lot of them look really, really unsustainable. For instance, one is the Los Angeles harbor. And obviously, you can't have hundreds of thousands or thousands of seabirds nesting in a working port. So a lot of questions on why is this? Why is this colony failing in recent years? And you can point fingers in all directions, and I personally think you're right in any direction you point them in. The forage fish that these birds depend on, there is active commercial fishing on them, and some feel it's at an unsustainable level. It's not monitored well enough. On top of that, even if it was, there is a lot of illegal fishing that happens in the area too. Obviously, as the water temperatures change year after year through climate change, you get a lot of the forage fish in areas that are too far, they're no longer close up to that region and are deeper down. So they're not available to the Harriman skulls and the elegant terns anymore. And we talked about the vaquita porpoise for a second earlier, and I wanted to draw them back in because there's a lot of gill netting that happens in the Gulf of California. This fishing method is not legal in most of the areas it's implemented there in Mexico because of its bycatch. There's a lot of marine mammal bycatch, and that is what is most of the vaquita mortality nowadays that we're able to document is from illegal gillnet fishing. And the gillnet fishers are going after a totuaba, this kind of anadromous fish that lives in the Gulf of California, that its swim bladder can get thousands to tens of thousands of dollars on the black market for traditional Chinese medicine in particular. So that's what it's being fished for. And, you're seeing these fishing communities that a lot of the fish that they traditionally fished on are maybe not present anymore. And then they have this opportunity to make thousands of dollars. And also there is some of drug cartel fisheries happening down there. So when I was talking about how the vaquita porpoise symbolizes saving the vaquita porpoise, you're working in a lot of different areas. For instance, Sea Shepherd, the environmental organization, does have an operation called Operation Miracle, and that's to save the vaquita porpoise. Talking with them, I feel that, of course, the hope is to save this population. There's only 20 left that we know of. They are not able to have a captive breeding program. It's likely that they're not going to, like I said, I think it's fairly likely they're going to run extinct in our time. But still, in that effort of fighting illegal fishing, protects marine mammals and potentially protects the seabirds as well, if some of their prey are then available to them. Again, so the future of this marine mammal, the future of this colony of birds is yet to be determined. It's changing really, really rapidly. One thing that's really fortunate about seabirds is they are long-lived. So, some of these birds live, some of these terns are living in their 20s and 30s. And again, the albatross still breeding in their 80s, in Wisdom's case, for instance. So these are long-lived birds, and they're up against a lot of different threats, but they are resilient, and hopefully there's things we can do to mitigate our impacts on them. I'm sure a lot of you read this study in 2019 and made a lot of headlines about all the birds lost, the humongous declines that are happening. And so birds up are against to a lot of threat. And I feel like this study, if you zoom in on it, one of the big things it pointed to is habitat loss. And in Baja California, there's habitat loss. In my opinion, the desert should not look like this. It's incredibly resource intensive to maintain a lot of the development there, and it's taking water from sources that could be utilized ecologically. For instance, the fact that the Colorado River just trickles into the Gulf of California and the estuary is basically gone is actually, I feel strongly, is the biggest threat to the totuaba, which is then the biggest threat to the vaquita porpoise, and then so on and so on and so on. So again, habitat loss and habitat preservation being one of the biggest things that can happen to save some of these species. But these birds utilizes a lot of different habitats, a lot of different corners of Baja, and I feel like that's one reason they tell such a good story between the nocturnal predators, between the islands, between the different endemics. There's so much diversity in avifauna there. So I hope you get to see them one day, and if not, you can still enjoy them from afar. Some of these birds are making thousands of mile migrations, changing habitats throughout changing climates. And it is incredible that these birds make it. These are really, really light animals that, some weigh like less than a nickel, and they're flying thousands of miles. And just, I hope when they get there, they can have a home for themselves. So I think they're really compelling and beautiful. And I think it's really beautiful to listen to the stories they tell us. And again, birds give us a really, really beautiful and clear story of the world around us and the ecosystems that we live in. So thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it. And yeah, that's what I have for you. I guess if nothing else, if anyone has any questions or anything, I haven't checked the chat or anything, but.
Steve, that was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, it's an honor to be able to give it to you all.
Does anybody out there have any questions in the either chat? I see some chat thank yous, etc. Any verbal questions for Steve? Steve, are you heading back there for to be a shipboard naturalist or for other reasons?
Yeah, so this luckily enough, I'm actually leaving in a few weeks. I'm boarding the ship in LA and then going down the Pacific coast, and I'll be in Mexico for all of December. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to it. It's a really beautiful place, and that's a really interesting time to be there. So.
Okay, lots of thank yous.
I have a question. I'm wondering, what are the negative impacts for the whales of the boats coming so close, or are there negative impacts?
So the negative impacts of the boats coming so close to the whales, it's not something that I know that has been studied. I think that it's pretty reasonable to assume that it is a disturbance and it is disturbing them for sure. I think that there's been a lot of study on sonic pollution underwater, for instance, on top of any kind of other, that alone is just a noisy sea. If there's a lot of noise underwater, we've seen in other species, them avoiding high trafficked areas, and particularly with diving whales, they tend to be really sensitive to sonic pollution. These whales don't really have options of other places to go. So in my personal opinion, I think it is a really amazing experience to get to see them. I think the whales would be better off if we weren't going there, if we weren't doing that. In their history, they survived, 2 different potential extinctions through hunting. They utilize, the area as a bombing range. So the fact that there is an idea of preservation, that there's an industry around preservation, I think is the best option that they've seen since they've been found by, by Western society. But I do think that there are impacts. I'm not sure how they've been measured, but for sure, I imagine there's negative impacts. I see in the
Steve,
chat.
Is there much local Mexican environmental activism going on, or is it mostly like these show the Sea Shepherd? Is it mostly international kind of efforts that are focused there, or how does that work?
That's a great question. Thanks for that opportunity to speak to it. There is a lot of conservation from Mexico. So between efforts like setting some of these areas as biosphere reserves, the Gulf Islands, the Pacific lagoons. The whale watching, the gray whale watching industry is really, really controlled. You can only go on local boats with permit holders from the small fishing villages. So it gives the small fishing villages an economic incentive to then preserve the gray whales. It's a more lucrative industry than fishing is for them. And speaking with them, and some of these people I've known personally for 4 years now, and a lot of them really enjoy that work and enjoy the whales, and are involved in protecting the whales. Also, there's an area in the Cape region called Cabo Pulmo on the southeast side. And it's got a really, really interesting story that I'll try to tell a really short version of. But basically, the fishermen there noticed that the fish populations were plummeting, and they were watching it before their eyes. This area that was once abundant fishing that gave them their livelihood was kind of becoming a desert. And so the fishers in the area decided to protect it, to make it its own reserve, and they petitioned the government. And after some time, were able to get national designation as a reserve, as a no fishing area. And, it was a huge economic hit because those people were fishing, but they started to offer it as, like you can go, there's ecotourism options there. But just from my experience, I've done some diving around the region. And once you enter that protected area, that again was started by the local Mexican fishers in that town, the diversity is incredible. You'll see sometimes videos of like schools of jacks numbering in the hundreds to thousands, and like huge shark populations. Almost all those videos are from Cabo Pulmo, and that's because of the Mexican fishers' efforts to preserve that area. So you see their efforts from locals to protect the area, but also efforts in conjunction with the Mexican government. And again, these eradication campaigns of predators on the islands is another good example. That's all led by Mexican government and different initiatives in Mexico. So there's lots and lots of conservation efforts from Mexico, in addition to some international ones too.
Could you give us the name of the organization that you do the tours? When you say it, it's somehow muffled.
Mm-hmm. I'll type it in the chat, but it's called Lindblad Expeditions, is who I work with down there. I'll be on the National Geographic Venture for December. And primarily it changes year to year which boats are down there, but we've been going there for decades. I've only worked for the company for 4 years, but the company's been going there for decades. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, thanks again, Steve. Not hearing any other questions. Maybe you've drummed up some business for Lindblad or National Geographic Explorer. This looks like a great trip. So I guess with that, we can wrap up our meeting, unless there's any final thing. Nope. Okay, well, thank you, Lisa, for putting